All right, my econ students, the topic of education, economics, lessons, whatever, for this week is going to be types of competition or market structures. So what we did last week was look at business organizations, but every business exists inside a certain type of market. Okay, now I'm not talking about like fast food markets or something like that, but different types of competition. Now we're going to look at four main types. They are monopoly, oligopoly, that's how you pronounce that one, monopolistic, and perfect or pure competition. Okay? Now we're going to wind up looking at monopoly first because this is the one you're familiar with, right? Now monopoly is going to be when a particular market is dominated by one seller, one firm, one business. Now, it does not mean that there is only one business. It could be that's the case. There's only one business, one company that sells a particular product or a particular service. That can certainly be a monopoly, but a monopoly just could be that one company dominates the way that market operates. All right? So there may be other companies there may be other businesses, but one of them is so powerful and makes so many of the sales that they dominate how that entire market is able to operate. Yep. Now, monopolies form for different reasons, and we'll look at a few of these here. But really the big thing is that the barriers to entry are so high. And we'll talk about that here on the next slide, but a barrier to entry being really, really high means that no other competitor is able to get into that market. So the reason there is a monopoly is because nobody else tries to be a competitor with that one firm, with that one company. All right. Now, if you are a monopoly, what can you do? Well, since you're the only one selling it, you can charge whatever it is you want. Although still, there's a limit on what it is they'll typically charge. Again, we'll get into that here in a little bit. All right. Now, barriers to entry. We just talked about those. This is how difficult is it for a new firm to get into that market. The higher the barriers to entry, the fewer competitors you will have within that market. So one big barrier to entry is startup costs. How much money do you have to spend at the outset to become a competitor within that market? For example, let's say we want to start a bakery. You're probably looking at around $100,000 of startup costs. You got to get all the baking equipment. You got to get the cash register. You probably need some store space, some display cabinets, all that stuff, right? But let's say you're going to start, I don't know, a bridge building firm. Well, all of a sudden now you're looking at buying moving equipment and earth moving equipment, and you need to have, I don't know, cranes and steel, all sorts of stuff. I don't build bridges. I don't know. Ask somebody who does. All right. And then the other big barrier to entry is going to be technology. Really, this is about know-how. What sort of educational stuff do you need, or what sort of, know-how, knowledge do you need to have in order to be able to get into that particular business? So if you want to get into baking, well, you need to know stuff about baking, all right? Maybe some of the science behind it if you really want to get fancy about it. But if you want to build those bridges, all of a sudden now you need to know things about engineering and stress loads and, working with governments. All of a sudden it becomes a lot more complicated. Now, what does this mean? Well, the barriers to entry and getting into the bridge building business are a lot higher than what you see in the bakery business. So you're going to see a lot more people in bakeries and baking business than what you're going to wind up seeing in the bridge building business. Okay, so the know-how and the amount of money that is needed at the outset is going to establish barriers to entry. The higher the barriers, the fewer competitors. Now, what you see in monopolies, for one reason or another, the barriers to entry are so extraordinarily high, absolute, complete, you don't have more than one competitor. All right, or if there are more than one competitor, there is more than one competitor, the other ones are small, and you only have that one guy, the monopoly, that dominates the entire thing. Okay, so other examples, these are examples of types of barriers to entry, economies of scale, look at that, brand loyalty, stuff like that. All right. Oh, and what can you do if you are a monopoly? Well, let's see, you can have pricing tactics where you set some things lower than others. This has to do with predatory pricing. This is where you purposely undercut your competitor in order to drive them out of business. Because if you're a monopoly and you're making money everywhere, you can afford to lose a little bit of money on one product or in one area or one geographic location, whereas another competitor may not be able to. So you undercut undercut them, drive them out of business, take it over, and then you jack up your prices again. So a classic example of this was Standard Oil with John D. Rockefeller way back in the day, right? And so Standard Oil will come into an area, sell its oil for a whole lot lower than what the local guys would, drive them out of business, and then raise the prices again. In fact, sometimes Standard Oil will come along and say, make an offer to the local guy at the outset and say, hey, you can sell out to us at the beginning, or you can take your chances. If you're smart, you went ahead and sold out because they were just going to kill you anyway. All right? So some people accuse Walmart of doing predatory pricing also, that they'll come into a small town and sell their groceries for really cheap, drive out the local grocery store, and then jack things back up again. All right. Brand proliferation is another example of a strategic barrier to entry. I like this one. So it shows all these cookies, right? You think about a cookie aisle. Well, at a grocery store, one of the most valuable things at a grocery store is actually the shelf space. Brands and food producers have to pay the grocery stores for a certain amount of shelf space. And they even have to test market their products to show that people actually want to buy this stuff and it's worthwhile being on the shelf, because the grocery store only has so much shelf space in order which to put this stuff, right? And so you have a company like Nabisco, and they just make all sorts of different flavors of Oreos. So you just have the Oreos, you got the pumpkin spice Oreos, and the mint Oreos, and the double stuffed Oreos, and the, white chocolate Oreos, I don't know, right? The Cakesters, all this stuff. And so they come up with all these different brands because the more brands and the more flavors they have, the more shelf space they can dominate in the cookie aisle. Which means there's less shelf space available for the other cookie guys. So if you look at the grocery store, like a Tom Thumb over there, you'll notice that in the cookie area, it's a whole lot of Nabisco Oreo stuff and a whole lot of Chips Ahoy, and there's not much room left over for everybody else. And that is done on purpose. All right? Now, monopoly. Now, why do you have monopolies? Sometimes, a lot of times, people think that, well, you wind up having one company, and through some sort of dishonest business practices, they're able to take everything over, and this is how they become the one company left, and everybody else is out in the cold. That's not always the case. You can actually get monopolies forming for different reasons, and some of them actually kind of make sense, and they're not necessarily a bad thing. All right. One type of monopoly is called an economy of scale. An economy of scale works like this, is that in many cases, the more you make, right, the more you produce, the cheaper it gets to produce each one, at least up to a point. There can be a point at which it reverses, but anyway. The more you make, the cheaper it is to produce each additional unit. Reason for this is that you can get good deals with your suppliers and get better bargains with them. Once you've built the equipment, you're able to pump out more product with very little additional cost. All right, whatever it is, it's cheaper to make. So imagine you get a company, and they've established themselves producing a good, and when they've already established themselves as a monopoly, they're able to produce additional goods for very cheaply, right? For each additional one, it's very cheap to produce each additional one. Whereas if a brand new competitor came in, they'd have to spend a whole lot of money to be able to produce even one item, all right? So from the competitor's point of view, it may not be worth even trying to get into that market segment, because the existing monopoly has such an advantage when it comes to costs, right? When it comes to production costs, that they can undercut them, right? So if I'm a new guy, I'd wind up having to sell my product for, let's say, $100 just to be able to break even. Whereas the existing monopoly could sell their competing product for, let's say, $80, and they're still able to make a profit. Well, what are they going to do? They're going to undercut me, sell it for $80, drive me out of business because I can't sell for that cheap, and then after I'm gone, they just bump their prices back up again. All right? So the existing monopoly can take advantage of the economies of scale. That for each additional unit they produce, right, these are units produced, each additional one, it costs them less and less to make each additional one. So the existing monopoly is producing at a price down here, whereas a new competitor would produce at a price up there, which means the new competitor doesn't bother getting in. Okay, so again, for that reason. Another type of monopoly is called a natural monopoly. A natural monopoly is going to be when it kind of makes sense to have a monopoly in this case. A very good example of this is utilities. So I have some electrical lines there, but you can also think of gas lines, phone lines, cable lines, even though you guys don't use those anymore. All right, sewer lines, water lines, right? All of those utilities are very good examples of natural monopolies. Now, what you wind up having here is that it makes sense to do it this way. Imagine that you wind up having 5 different gas companies, and they're all building gas lines through neighborhoods and big old gas mains, right? The big pipes, and to be able to pipe it to your house. So you have 5 different gas lines attached to your house, and 5 different water lines, and 5 different electrical lines. Well, that doesn't make sense. That's very, very costly. It's also very complicated. It's inefficient. And who wants it that way? It could even be dangerous, right? You want 5 different gas lines going to your house. So you wind up having one company, the monopoly, that built out that utility there, and they're able to stay a monopoly because it doesn't make sense for a competitor to come in and build their own lines, right? So a lot of us around here, we have Encore as the electrical company that owns the lines anyway. It doesn't make any sense for some other company to come in and build their own electrical lines, right? It wouldn't be cost efficient. So a natural monopoly is going to be when it's efficient this way, and utilities are a very good example of this. Okay. And monopolies can change over time. For example, cell phones came along and they disrupted phone monopolies, right? So that still is the case, right? You've got a natural monopoly for phone lines to your house. One of them goes to your house. You may not use it, but it's there. But because of cell phones, a lot of us have gone to that. We cut the cord, and so technology has disrupted this quite a bit. Same thing with cable. Some monopolies can actually be guaranteed by the government. So right here, what we have is a patent, a U.S. patent. You come up with an idea, you can patent it, which means that you have a monopoly over whatever that idea is. Nobody else can use that idea unless they either buy the patent from you or they license it from you. They get your permission to be able to produce whatever it is, all right, to be able to use that idea. So that patent is a government-provided monopoly to you. The reason we do this, by the way, is that's supposed to ensure that you are actually going to make use of that idea. That because you can profit from it, you'll actually do something with it. So this is why you're given that patent. All right. Copyrights are the same thing on, let's say, music or things that are written, right? You got trademarks, stuff like that. These are all examples of government monopolies. Another type of government monopoly is franchises and licenses. A franchise, don't think of this as being like business franchise we talked about in the last unit. A franchise in this sense is going to be when a government gives a contract to a certain provider or vendor or company to do something. They give them exclusive access. A good example of this would be in the city of Rockwall. There's one waste management company. There's one trash company that picks up the trash for everybody in the city. It doesn't matter where you are. All right, so that one trash company is given a franchise agreement. So that trash company has a monopoly on trash collection within the city of Rockwall. Or let's say it's a city park or a national park and there's one food vendor that's allowed to sell food there. That would again be a franchise monopoly. Licenses are another example of a government monopoly. This is going to be where you have to get permission from the government to be able to operate either a business or to participate in a certain occupation. A good example of this is that little medallion right there, this New York City taxicab medallion. In New York City, if you want to operate one of those YOLO taxicabs, each one of them has to have one of these medallions. It's cheap to borrow from the city, but there's not that many of them, and demand for them is high. So if you want to get an additional one, you have to buy it from somebody else who already has it, and it costs big money. All right? But this would be, again, monopoly. And big businesses love licenses and they love franchise agreements. It usually benefits them over the little guy, including licensing occupations, like, say, cosmetology licenses. Those tend to favor whoever is established. All right. Last type of government monopoly would be industrial organizations. Sports teams are a good example of this. So, sports leagues. So if you look at the NFL, it has a monopoly over professional football in the U.S. I know the XFL has come back, right? It's a thing again. Oh, but it is likely going to have trouble succeeding, right? MLB is another example of this. And these are recognized as being monopolies, but they're allowed to exist. There was even a Supreme Court case that allowed the MLB to exist, and this is assumed to extend outwards to the other professional sports leagues as well. Yep. And they also give you a very good example of why it's difficult to challenge these guys, is that if you want to challenge one of these, you want to open up your own professional sports league, Let's say you want to have your own professional baseball league, right? Not a team, but an entirely new league. Well, you have to compete with the existing MLB. All right, so you'd have to have enough teams established, and you have to get TV rights, and you have to compete for the talent and the players, which is going to cost you big money in and of itself. You're not going to pay for that. All right. So it's difficult to get into that. The NFL was only successfully challenged once in the late 50s, early 60s with the AFL. And the AFL eventually merged with the NFL and became one gigantic happy NFL. All right, but in order to even do that, it took millionaires and billionaires in different parts of the country to challenge that monopoly of the NFL. The barriers to entry are very, very high. The original XFL, that was like in 2001, I think. It only lasted for one season. They had rule changes. One of them was you could put nicknames on the back. Rod Smart became famous for He Hate Me. And those were the team names. Anyway, so Monopoly, you only have one firm that dominates. There's no variety of goods because you only have that one company producing them, so you're not going to have variety. The barriers to entry are absolute, and they also have complete control over price because they can make it whatever it is they want, hypothetically anyway. All right? Monopolies are also able to engage in price discrimination. And what this is, don't think of price discrimination as like racial discrimination or something like that. The discrimination here is you discriminate among different types of consumer groups, not again based on race or something like that, but based upon their ability and willingness to pay. For example, senior citizens will get discounts at restaurants and at movie theaters. Why? Well, because they're not willing to pay a full price, basically. They won't go if they got to pay a full price for the meal or pay a full price for the movie. And so they'll get discounts at these places because now they're more likely to go. Now, the restaurant may not make as much profit off of the senior citizen as what they would have if they made them pay full price, but because the senior citizen has showed up at all and spent money, they're still going to make more profit than they would have had they not given the discount to the senior citizen. Same thing with movie discounts, right? So kids get discounts at movies. Right? Why do they get discounts? Well, because the parents don't want to pay full price to take their kids to the movies, at least, when movie theaters were operating. So you lower the price for them, and now the parents are more likely to take their kids there. It costs the same amount of money to show the movie no matter what. They get extra butts in the seat, which means they make a little bit more money on the tickets. But even more crucially, they're going to spend money at the concessions, which is really where movie theaters make their money. All right. So, in order to do this, you have to have some sort of market power, right? You control more of the market, make more of the sales. The bigger monopoly you are, the more market power you have, such as you are a monopoly, you can engage in more price discrimination. But you're assuming you have different groups of customers who will pay different amounts. It could be senior citizens, it could be kids, it could be students, right? Whatever. There's another assumption here that you have difficult resale, right? If you didn't have difficult resale, then what would happen is that somebody would buy it for cheap and then they sell it for full price or almost full price and be able to collect the profit. All right. So, last little bit here, as far as I recall, monopolists will set the price higher than what you would have in a more competitive market, but they can't charge just obscene prices. If they charge too much, then people simply won't buy the product. All right, the monopolist's goal is to make profit, the most profit possible, and so there's a little formula for this and graphs. I'm not going to worry about this. So they'll definitely charge more, but there's still a limit on just how much they can charge. All right, we talked about market power here. We talked about predatory pricing. All right. So you don't want monopolies. Well, what can you do? You have the government coming along and doing antitrust laws. A trust is a type of monopoly. This is how Standard Oil got broken up into a whole bunch of smaller oil companies. Some of the names you know, some of the names you don't, because they got eaten up over time. All right, through mergers. But you regulate the businesses. You make sure they're all doing what it is they're supposed to. They all have the same playing field. They all follow the same rules. And you try not to give any one of them more power than another. You try to keep everything fair. If a monopoly forms, break it up. So Standard Oil was broken up. AT&T, the AT&T you know now is nothing like the AT&T that existed in 1984 before it was broken up. At that point in time, there was exactly one telecommunication company in the U.S. That was AT&T, American Telephone and Telegraph. It was the largest corporation on the planet. It employed more people than any other corporation in the world and made more money than anybody else. And it controlled all phone service in the United States, so local, long distance, you name it. And so it was finally broken up in 1984 through antitrust action. And so over time, it's recombined into what we now know as AT&T, which is not even the original AT&T, basically. It's just the name as far as anything goes. But anyway, you can break apart monopolies. What you can also do is keep monopolies from forming to begin with. So if you don't want them, don't allow them to form. So when companies want to merge now, they have to get permission from the federal government to merge together, especially if they're big players. And if the government agencies think that this would be bad for consumers because it would reduce competition too much, then they'll be prohibited from merging. All right, you can also preserve incentives to try to encourage companies to be competitive with each other. All right, trend over the past few decades anyway has been deregulation, allowing more mergers to take place for various reasons. Some of that has reversed a little bit recently. All right, and we'll stop there and come back to oligopoly.